Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Every truck driver is aware that their CB radio is essential to their survival while driving. However, what occurs if that lifeline turns into your greatest nightmare? I'm Mike Rodriguez, and I've spent the last 23 years transporting goods throughout our wonderful nation. I've witnessed my fair share of odd things on the highways, but nothing could have prepared me for what transpired on a chilly February night between Amarillo and Oklahoma City on Interstate 40, which still haunts me to this day. I was transporting a typical load of electronics from Nashville to Los Angeles. The route and the cargo are not very noteworthy. It was my second day traveling, and even though the weather was getting bad, I was moving along nicely. Light snowfall was predicted, but by the time I reached the Texas Panhandle, it was falling heavily enough to reduce visibility to perhaps 100 yards. As usual, I had my CB set to channel 19, listening to other drivers' conversations regarding the state of the roads and potential speed bumps. All day, the radio had been operating without any issues. I had discussed the weather with a number of other truckers, provided information about which truck stops offered parking, and engaged in the typical road chatter that keeps you company when you're stuck on a long length of highway and darkness. With all the latest technology, my 2018 Peterbilt 579 rig has a CB that was a premium Cobra 29, which I had installed myself only 6 months prior. I took great pride in that radio. Crystal clear transmission and reception with a greater range than most. At approximately 11:30 that evening, the radio abruptly stopped working. I was traveling through the remote area between Amarillo and the Oklahoma border. There was complete silence, no background noise, no static. I checked the volume, adjusted the squelch, and even clicked the microphone a few times to make sure it was working properly, but it was dead. I thought perhaps a connector or a fuse had sprung loose from all the bouncing on these bumpy highways in Texas. As I reached behind the dashboard to inspect the electrical connections, the radio abruptly came to life with a loud burst of static that startled me. Any weak signals should have been filtered by the squelch, which was still fully engaged. However, this communication somehow was as plain as day as it cut through. The next thing I heard chilled my blood. Pete with the reefer trailer heading east. When driving in this weather, you should slow down. The vacant roadway that stretched out in front of and behind me caught my attention. The man on the radio had described my truck exactly, but as far as I could see through the falling snow, mine was the only set of headlights in either direction. In fact, I was driving a Peterbilt eastward while towing a refrigerated trailer. It might have been a coincidence, but I didn't like something about the voice. It came from the bottom of a well and had a hollow, distant sound. I turned my microphone on. This is Pete heading east. To whom am I speaking? Driver. For perhaps 10 seconds, the air was static until the voice returned. This time, it's clearer, but it still has that odd echoing effect. Mike, you're having a nice time. Since you left Amarillo, have you not been pushing hard? The back of my head is hairy, neck lifted. I hadn't informed anyone I was from Amarillo, and I hadn't even revealed my name on the radio. I verified my departure time in my logbook. This voice somehow knew information about my travel that no random motorist should have known, because I had left a truck stop in Amarillo precisely 9:15. How do you know my name? I tried to speak steadily as I asked into the microphone. I know a lot about you, Mike. 23 years of traveling, 18 years of marriage to Linda years, to college-age children. You travel this route 6 times a year, stopping at the same truck stops and ordering the same food at the Oklahoma City diner each time. My hands on the steering wheel began to shake. The voice was entirely right about everything. I was married to Linda for 18 years. Our son David was a freshman at Oklahoma University, and our daughter Emma was a junior at Texas State. Yes, I did do this identical route for the electronics company 6 times a year. Additionally, I frequently visited Mel's Diner in Oklahoma City to sample their chicken. Special fried steak. What the devil is this? I insisted. However, I was reaching for my cell phone to dial 911 even as I posed the inquiry. Perhaps I was being followed. Perhaps this was a complex pretext for a carjacking or robbery. However, my phone displayed no signal at all when I checked it, which was not conceivable on Interstate 40. Along this road, cell towers are spaced every few kilometers. The voice returned instantly, and this time it sounded as though it were with me in the taxi. Mike, don't waste your time on the phone. Right present. Nobody can assist you. I've been waiting for you. You see, I'm still waiting for someone like you, someone who drives alone, someone who frequently travels this road, and someone who, in the event of an emergency, won't be noticed for a few days. Despite the snow and ice on the road, I stepped on the gas and drove my rig to 80 miles per hour. I had to find other individuals, get to the next truck stop, and leave from the person who was engaging in this horrible game. However, the speaker seemed to know exactly what I would do. Mike, running won't help. You're speeding up, I see. Your knuckles are white on the steering wheel, as I can see. I see the perspiration on your brow in spite of the chill. That's when it hit me, the scariest thing of all. Since this chat began, I had been continuously checking my mirrors, and I was still surrounded by no other cars. As far as I could tell, the roadway was deserted in both directions, could observe. Whoever was speaking to me wasn't driving next to me or in a truck that was following me. They were in a completely other place. However, they managed to watch everything I did. You're where? Into the microphone I yelled. How do you see me? The most terrifying thing I have ever heard in my life was the laughter that reverberated across the radio. It began slowly and increased in volume, reverberating and warping until it filled my truck's whole cab. The sound like the laughter of a long dead person. Mike, where am I? Here I am. I've spent 27 years right here. Ever since that snowfall when my rig slid off the road. Ever since I rolled down the hillside immediately before you, ejaculating on the ice. My CB radio crackled with the voices of drivers who were unable to stop when I died alone in the cab. Assistance during the storm. It was just barely visible through the snow falling when I gazed forward through my windscreen. I could see the mangled remains of what had once been a semi-truck at the foot of the embankment, which was, in fact, on the right side of the highway. The caravan was split up from the tractor, both rusted and covered with snow, and the asphalt where the vehicle had left the road decades earlier still had ancient skid marks on it. Mike, do you see me now? Are you able to view my grave? My headlights swept across the overturned cab as I passed the debris, and I thought I spotted a figure. It was sitting in the driver's seat, briefly illuminated, wearing a trucker cap and flannel shirt. The man's eyes reflected my headlights like an animal in the dark, and his face was pallid. Another crackle came from the radio. I've been waiting for someone to stop for 27 years. Someone to remember that this is where a driver died. Seeing trucks run by for 27 years without even a moment of silence for a fellow driver who sacrificed his life for these roads. However, you will remember, Mike, you're going to share what happened here with everyone. About the times when truckers used to watch out for one another. About the way we used to pay respect to the dead. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the radio died once more. Despite my best efforts, It remained lifeless for the remainder of my journey. 3 hours later, I finally arrived in Oklahoma City, and my first action was to stop at a truck stop and inquire about the wreck I had witnessed. The veteran at the fuel desk attested to the fact that a driver by the name of Tommy Martinez had passed away in that location was the scene of a rollover accident 27 years ago in February 1998. He claimed that Tommy was a good driver, a devoted family man, and someone who always stepped in to support fellow truckers in need. When I came home, I had 3 different electrical shops, checked the CB radio. They all told me the same thing. The radio was operating well. It shouldn't have died on the highway that night, because all of the connections were strong. However, I am aware of what I went through and what that voice informed me. Now, whenever I pass the embankment on that route, I slow down, I turn on my radio and utter a few words in memory of driver Tommy Martinez, who passed away 27 years ago while driving alone in the snow. Additionally, I swear that occasionally, just occasionally, I hear a quiet voice saying, "Thank you, driver," prior to the static returning to quiet. For 15 years, I have been traveling the same route. I am intimately familiar with every rest area, diner, and truck stop. That's why everything I believe to be true about reality has been called into doubt by what transpired last month. For almost 20 years, I, Robert Hayes, have been transporting goods between Phoenix and Denver. To get to Denver, take Interstate 25 north, then Interstate 40 east to Albuquerque, and finally Interstate 17 north to Flagstaff. I've made this exact route over 300 times without any problems, and I could drive it while blindfolded. Everything I hold about the nature of reality itself is called into question by what I'm about to tell you. It began on a Tuesday evening in November, one of those ideal evenings in the desert where the stars appear to be close enough to touch and the air is clear. I was transporting a bunch of equipment from a Tempe warehouse to a Denver distribution center. Neither the timeline nor the cargo were out of the ordinary. I had departed Phoenix at 2 p.m. and was traveling through northern Arizona's high desert area at a great pace. My gasoline gauge indicated that I had just under a quarter tank by 9:30 that evening as I approached Flagstaff. After 15 years of traveling this route, I've learnt to always start at Flagstaff before beginning the lengthy journey across New Mexico. I have been regularly using a pilot truck stop at exit 2011, just off Interstate 40, for more than 10 years. Reasonably priced gas, good meals, spotless toilets, and plenty parking for a ridge in full size. Over the years, I've probably made 200 stops there, but I noticed a change when I got closer to exit 201. I noticed a smaller, older-looking sign that just said Desert Rose Truck Stop in faded yellow in place of the well-known blue and red pilot sign that should have been visible from 2 miles away. Letters, perhaps Pilot had been acquired or rebranded, I reasoned. I had traveled through this exact location only 3 weeks prior, and everything had been normal, so it felt odd. As soon as I got off, I saw that the road to the truck stop was changed. Rather than the broad, this tiny 2-lane road, which looped back into the desert before opening up into a parking area, had the well-paved entry I was accustomed to. The entire area had an abandoned, dilapidated look that was very different from what I remembered, and the asphalt was aged and fractured, with weeds growing through the cracks. The actual truck stop was a modest, one-story structure whose architecture appeared to have been out of date since the 1970s. Large areas were in shadow due to burned-out parking lot lighting and faded turquoise paint on the walls. Perhaps 10 or 8 other trucks were parked in the lot. They were all older models that I was unfamiliar with. No gleaming new Kenworths or Peterbilts, no cutting-edge aerodynamic designs. These trucks have the appearance of being in a museum. I approached the building after parking next to a battered Mac that must have been at least 30 years old, instead of the digital displays that had been commonplace for at least 20 years. The fuel pumps were the vintage type, with mechanical numerals that switched when you pumped. Diesel was listed at 98 cents a gallon, which had not been feasible since the early 1990s, and the prices were absurdly low. The truck stop was equally odd inside. It was difficult to see clearly because of the weak, yellow lighting that gave everything an amber hue. The walls were panelled in faux wood grain that had likely been fashionable decades before, while the flooring were covered in broken and discoloured brown linoleum dots. An old man with thick glasses and thinning grey hair behind the desk gazed up at me with strangely empty eyes. He said, "Philip," in a voice that sounded as though it was coming from below. "Yeah, diesel on pump 4, I said, sliding my credit card across to him. He turned the card over in his hands as if he had never seen one before, and he gazed at it for a long time. "We only take cash here, son." That ought to have been my first serious red flag. The majority of drivers pay with credit cards for tax purposes, and every truck stop in America accepts them, but I simply wanted to refuel and get back on the road because I was exhausted. I proceeded to the corner where there appeared to be an ATM. It was an old-fashioned machine, and when I walked up to it, the small green screen blinked. Nothing happened when I attempted to insert my card. The slot appeared to be too small, as if it were made for cards from a different age. The clerk, who was reading an ancient newspaper, stated, "The ATM is broken. In 1987, the bank closed." In the hopes of getting a cup of coffee and possibly a sandwich to go, I made my way to the food area. The shelves were filled with items I hadn't seen in years, including newspapers with headlines about 1980s events, candy bars and packaging that seemed decades out of date, and glass bottles of Coca-Cola with vintage labels. The coffee maker belonged in a museum because it was one of those vintage percolator units. It smelt like it had been sitting there 4 days, and when I tried to pour a cup, it came out thick and black. As I glanced at the other patrons, I saw that they were all wearing odd outfits. The truckers' hair was combed in ways that hadn't been in style since, and they wore baseball caps and flannel shirts that appeared to have been purchased at thrift stores. I was a child. A newspaper with a headline about the Challenger space shuttle explosion was being read by one individual. Another was griping to his friend about the fact that petrol had risen to $1 per gallon. I said to the man who was reading the newspaper, "Pardon me, what day is it today?" He gave me the impression that I had posed the most foolish question imaginable. Naturally, November 15th, 1986. "Do you feel okay, son?" My blood froze. That was 37 years ago on November 15th, 1986. It wasn't until 1987 that I was born. And yet here I was, surrounded by folks who seemed to legitimately think they were in the 1980s, standing in what seemed like a completely operational truck stop from the past. Since I knew there were cell towers all throughout this area, I checked my cell phone, but there was absolutely no signal. I went back outside in the hopes that some fresh air would help me process what was going on. My truck was still parked where I had left it, and it didn't look at all like it belonged among the older cars around it. Among an assortment of antiquities, my 2021 Freightliner Cascadia stood out like a spaceship because to its LED lights and contemporary aerodynamic appearance. With or without petrol, I made the decision to depart right away. My gut told me to leave as soon as possible since there was something really wrong with this property. I got back into my cab and turned on the engine, but my truck would not move as I attempted to back out of the parking spot. The motor was operating. The wheels seemed to be stuck in molasses, but everything was okay. I tried forward and backward, but it didn't work. The truck had been rendered absolutely immobile. I became aware of the other truckers in the parking lot. At that point, all of them were standing outside their cars, looking at me with the same blank looks on their faces that I had noticed on the cashier. Within, they stood there like statues, watching me struggle with my truck, without moving or speaking. Upon closer inspection, I saw that their trucks were not in motion. The stacks are not emitting any exhaust. No lights, No noise from the engine. They appeared to have been parked for decades as they sat there in an attempt to communicate with another motorist on the highway. I tried my CB radio. Breaker 19 is a goods dog searching Interstate 40 for any eastbound traffic. At the Desert Rose truck stop exit 201, I need help. Return. Just static. I experimented with many channels, requested emergency help, even made an attempt to get to the pilot truck stop, which ought to have been placed exactly where this location was. Absolutely no answer. As if the radio was broadcasting into space. I reached for my cell phone and attempted to dial 911, but the screen indicated that there was absolutely no service. It was difficult in this area to have even one pub. I experimented with turning the phone on and off while only looking for emergency calls. Nothing was successful. As soon as I stepped inside, it seemed as though all of the contemporary technology had vanished. There were more and more truckers in the parking lot. There were more males coming out of the structure. They were all dressed in old clothes. They were all looking at me with those lifeless, vacant eyes. They started marching slowly and carefully in the direction of my truck, as if they were all following the same unheard beat. I restarted the engine and increased the RPMs to their maximum, but the truck remained immobile. I could see the mob approaching through my mirrors. Now, there must have been 20 or 30 of them, all moving towards my cab in perfect formation. They had expressionless, pale features. Furthermore, it appeared to me that none of them were breathing. I became aware of the terrible reality at that point. These were not human beings. In this location, which existed outside of normal time, there were echoes or shadows from the past. There was no actual business at the Desert Rose truck stop, some sort of paranormal trap, a remnant of the 1980s that had managed to survive and was now attempting to cite me as its most recent victim. I shut my eyes and focused more intently than I had ever done before. I considered my children, my wife, Linda, and the real world, where I belonged. I imagined the real pilot truck stop that ought to have existed here, complete with credit card readers, contemporary pumps, and cell phone using drivers. I concentrated on 2024, my actual life, and all that was genuine and real. My truck jerked forward so violently as I opened my eyes that I almost collided with the steering wheel. I was sitting in the parking lot of the pilot truck stop I had always anticipated to find, and the ghostly trucker population had disappeared. The contemporary blue and the night sky was illuminated by a red sign. Current model vehicles were parked all around me, and the fuel pumps were digital. For 10 minutes, I sat there in shock, trying to comprehend what had just transpired. My cell phone displayed the right date and time, as well as full signal strength when I looked at it. I discovered that when I looked at my gasoline gauge, remained at the exact spot where I had turned off the freeway, reading just under a quarter tank. I walked inside the cockpit to make the payment after filling up my truck. The clerk was a young woman with a warm grin and contemporary clothes. As she processed my credit card payment, she inquired, "How are you doing tonight? Has a truck stop ever been termed where is the Desert Rose?" I questioned her. She appeared perplexed. "I'm not aware of any. This pilot has spent almost 12 years here. It was only Desert before that. Do you ask why?" I couldn't bring myself to be honest with her. I simply believed I had a different memory. Regards. I didn't even switch on the CB radio, and I drove the rest of the way to Denver in total stillness. I researched the area surrounding Flagstaff after I arrived home. My blood ran cold again as I discovered what I had. At that precise spot, there had once been a truck stop known as the Desert Rose, but on November 15, 1986, it was destroyed by fire. The proprietor and the majority of his frequent patrons were among the 23 persons who perished in the fire. The site had been abandoned until the pilot was constructed in 2012, and the source of the fire was never identified. I still traveled that road twice a month, and each time I stopped for gasoline, I go to the pilot. However, occasionally I catch a glimpse of that faded yellow sign in my peripheral vision when I approach exit 201 late at night. The truck stop, known as Desert Rose, is still in place, stuck in November 1986, waiting for another motorist to stop for 98 cents a gallon of petrol. I am aware that I will turn into one of those truckers with empty eyes if I ever see that sign again, and allow myself to think it is genuine, waiting for the next victim to join our group, while lingering in the parking lot in definitely eventless procession of the deceased. After 30 years of hauling, I discovered one rule. Never inquire about the cargo. Simply pick it up, deliver it, and get compensated. However, there are many that make you regret breaking that rule. I'm Marcus Thompson, and I've been up all night telling you this, each night for the previous 6 months. It has caused me to re-evaluate all of my beliefs about good and wrong, as well as the distinction between doing what is morally right and obeying commands. Over the course of my 30 years as a long-haul driver, I have transported everything, from medical supplies to military hardware to live chickens. I've always taken great satisfaction in being discreet, dependable, and professional. You follow the shipper's instructions and don't ask questions. You grab the money and drive away when they give you twice the usual amount for a quick delivery. For the majority of my career, that mindset worked well for me until the night I took on the load that made all the difference. On a Thursday night in early September, the call was received at a truck stop outside of Memphis. I was sitting in my trailer, completing my required rest period and preparing my next course of action. Although I had never worked with the dispatcher before, he claimed to be from a logistics firm that had agreements with a number of clients I had previously hauled for. It looked like a simple enough task. In Memphis Industrial District, pick up a sealed trailer, transport it to a storage facility located outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Time was of the essence. The remuneration was excellent, but the delivery had to be finished before sunrise. $3,000 for a trip that should have taken 4 hours. What am I transporting? For safety and insurance reasons, it was appropriate for me to ask. Medical supplies was the dispatcher's prompt response. Time-sensitive medications that must be transported at a particular temperature. The trailer has been sealed and loaded. Already, hooking up and driving is all that is required. Never stop for anything other than fuel until it is absolutely required. And never open the caravan. When it comes to cold chain maintenance, the client is extremely picky. The haste and high remuneration were explained by medical supplies. When pharmaceutical businesses need emergency deliveries, particularly for temperature control, they were known for paying premium rates. Sensitive drugs. I had previously transported comparable loads without any problems. I accepted the assignment and was given instructions to the pickup spot. I was sent to an unfamiliar industrial area on the outskirts of Memphis by the address. The majority of the region was made up of vacant lots and shuttered warehouses. It was the sort of neighborhood that appeared dubious during the day and blatantly unsafe at night. I located the designated warehouse, a plain structure with little lighting and no signage, at the end of a dead-end street. At the entrance, I was greeted by a lone security officer who led me to a loading dock where the trailer was waiting. The caravan was a typical 53-foot white refrigerated unit without any identifying information or business marks. The refrigeration unit was already operating, buzzing loudly to keep the goods within at whatever temperature was needed. Surprisingly, little paperwork was presented to me by the security guy. No comprehensive manifest, no particular handling instructions, only a simple bill of lading with the delivery address in Little Rock and the cargo classified as medical goods. As I backed my tractor up to the kingpin, the guard stated, "The trailer is sealed and ready to go. To remind you, the boss says, don't open it for whatever reason. The temperature alarm sounds. You give this number a call right away." He gave me a business card that included no name of the company or other details, only the phone number. I completed my routine pre-trip examination, plugged up the caravan and connected the electrical and airline cables. Everything appeared to be typical. The temperature of the refrigeration unit remained constant at 38, substantially within the typical range for pharmaceuticals. Both a regular lock and what looked to be a tamper evidence seal were used to secure the caravan doors. After getting my copy and signing the paperwork, I started to drive towards Interstate 40. The drive was entirely ordinary for the first hour. Traffic was light, my tractor and the trailer were following each other correctly, and the refrigeration unit was keeping the temperature stable. I was getting settled for what I thought would be a simple journey to Little Rock after making good time through downtown Memphis. I heard the sound for the first time at that moment. It began as a slight scraping sound, which at first I thought was caused by anything moving inside the caravan. Occasionally, loads settled while being transported, particularly if they weren't adequately fastened. However, upon closer inspection, the sound sounded too purposeful and regular to be cargo moving. It appeared as though someone was purposefully scratching the trailer's interior walls. I switched off my radio and paid closer attention. After perhaps 30 seconds, the scratching ceased entirely. I waited for it to start up again, but all I could hear was the constant hum of the air conditioner and the typical sound of my tires on the asphalt. I persuaded myself that it was either a figment of my imagination or some unfamiliar mechanical noise coming from the caravan. After 20 minutes or so, the scratching again, but this time it was accompanied with a chilling sensation. It came from within the sealed caravan and sounded like muffled voices. The desperate, terrified sound of people trying to shout through gags or from behind soundproofing, rather than the distinct sound of conversation. Like toddlers, the voices were frenzied and high-pitched, or ladies who are distressed. I parked on the highway's shoulder and listened to the noises from the caravan behind me while my motor sat there idle. The scraping was more desperate now, and now I could plainly hear several voices, all of them frantic and afraid. The interior walls were being pounded by someone, even over the sound of the refrigerator unit. The metallic hits of the caravan were clearly audible. My initial reaction was to dial 911. Then I recalled the business card I had received from the security guy. The directions had been unambiguous. I was meant to contact if there were any issues with the cargo or the temperature. That number right away. This might have been a test. Or perhaps what I was hearing had a plausible explanation. I pressed the card's number. As if anticipating my call, a man picked up on the first ring. "Is there a problem with the delivery? There are sounds coming from inside the caravan," I remarked, attempting to maintain a calm voice. "It sounds like there are people in there," the man said without hesitation. "What you are hearing is the sound of live medical test subjects transporting primates for valid pharmacological research. We employ safe enclosure and soundproofing because they get upset during transportation. This is entirely lawful and appropriately allowed. Delivering the caravan is your responsibility. Tampering with the cargo is not." I heard sounds that might have been made by primates. Laboratory animals were frequently used in medical studies, and when in pain, monkeys or apes could actually make astonishingly human sounds. Though it was unpleasant to consider, it was both legal and essential for creating life-saving new drugs. Although I knew other drivers who had successfully carried cattle and lab animals, I had never previously hauled live animals. We have discovered that it is simpler to just refer to it as medical supplies. The animals serve as medical equipment for the aim of research. Can you proceed to the delivery place, or is there a real issue with the transport? For an additional minute, I listened to the sounds coming from the caravan. The banging and scratching persisted, but it was easier to put up with since it was coming from lab animals and not people. I had consumed a lot of meat from animals that had likely endured worse living and dying conditions than these study participants were. It was a necessary evil if their suffering resulted in life-saving medical discoveries. I said to the fellow on the phone, "I can go on. Fantastic. You're getting paid a lot to make this delivery without any issues. I have faith that you will fulfill your professional responsibilities." The noises coming from the trailer only grew louder as I shifted the vehicle back into drive and drove on towards Little Rock. The voices grew more urgent, the hammering more violent, the clawing more desperate. An additional hour later, I was starting to question the justification I had been provided. I had never heard any creatures sound like these. They had a distinctly human voice, and they sounded as though they were in pain in ways that would not be necessary for any valid study. I stopped once again and made my way back to the caravan. When I was standing directly in front of the sounds, they were significantly louder next it, and I could now hear distinct voices. A man shouting something I couldn't make out through the metal walls, a lady sobbing, a youngster pleading for assistance. My mind was clear of any uncertainty. These people were stuck in the caravan and desperately needed assistance. I examined the caravan door seals and locks. Breaking them could perhaps save the lives of those trapped inside, but it would also erase evidence of whatever crime was occurring. I considered my reputation, my 30 years of professional driving experience, and the $3,000 I was getting paid for this delivery. Then I considered the voices I could hear, the fear and despair in those human voices. To get the bolt cutters for my toolbox, I walked back to my tractor. 4 years, I had kept them on hand in case I ever needed to cut a broken lock or damaged luggage strap, but I never thought I'd need them to break into my own caravan. I placed the cutters on the regular lock, my hands trembling. Either this action would ruin my career and possibly land me in jail, or it was the most significant thing I would ever accomplish. Like butter, the lock sliced through. Although it required a bit more work, the bolt cutters also got past the tamper evidence seal. I reached for the trailer door's handle and yanked it open. I will always be troubled by what I witnessed in that caravan. No lab animals were present. No medical supplies were available. In conditions that belonged in a nightmare, 17 people, mostly women and children, were tied to the trailer's walls. They were filthy, undernourished, and extremely afraid. An explanation: a few of them suffered injuries. They were all traumatized, and they all stared at me as if I were a monster sent to destroy them or their savior. I made a 911 call right away. 30 minutes later, the paramedics and police discovered a human trafficking enterprise that had been delivering victims from Memphis to Arkansas's buyers. People were being sold into prostitution, enslavement, and worse, in exchange for the medical supplies. One of the most heinous crimes imaginable was concealed behind the lawful pharmaceutical research. I shattered the seal and opened that caravan, which is why 17 individuals are still alive today. The FBI then informed me that the majority of those victims would have most likely vanished forever into a web of criminal organizations that saw people as nothing more than throwaway property if I had carried out the delivery as directed. Within a week, the man who answered the emergency phone number, the security guard who loaded the caravan, and the dispatcher who hired me were all taken into custody. However, I still reflect on how close I was to driving away every night when I woke up. How nearly I chose to sacrifice my career and $3,000 for the lives of 17 innocent people. How many other drivers have transported comparable cargoes without ever inquiring, breaking seals, or realizing the human cargo they were unwittingly transporting? I no longer haul goods. I was unable to go on driving with the knowledge that victims in need of assistance could be in any caravan. Since I've discovered that sometimes breaking the law is the most professional thing you can do, I now work with law enforcement, teaching police to see the warning signs of human trafficking, and assisting in the investigation of unusual cargo movements. Additionally, the most crucial supply is occasionally the one in which you never arrive at, the destination. It is said that stopping is more risky than driving when trucking. I learnt that lesson the hard way on Interstate 80. near mile marker 247. I've been hauling goods for 18 years, and my name is Daniel Cruz. I have always taken great satisfaction in being a cautious driver. In addition to maintaining my equipment, keeping my logs up to date, and abiding by all the rules, I also pay close attention to where I park during my required rest periods. That focus on safety is what saved my life when I came upon something that still causes me to always check my mirrors 6 months later. The event occurred while transporting auto parts for a Detroit manufacturer on a normal run from Los Angeles to Chicago. I was jogging on Interstate 80, one of the busiest trucking roads in the nation, in the middle of Nebraska in late October. The climate it was clear. There wasn't much traffic, and I was moving really quickly. I started searching for a secure spot to stop for the night after driving 9 hours and getting close to my required 10-hour break. Over the years, I've come to realize that not every truck stop is the same. Some have good lighting and lots of other drivers and good security. Others are remote, unmaintained, and draw the type of individuals that prey on truckers transporting expensive goods. I've always had a straightforward rule: park in an area with other trucks, lights, and ideally some sort of presence of security. The rest stop with truck parking at mile marker 247 satisfied all of my requirements. Also, I believed, with separate parking for vehicles and trucks, hygienic facilities, and sufficient lighting, the rest area was a typical Department of Transportation establishment all across the complex. By the time I got there at 9:30 that night, 4 more trucks were already parked in the commercial vehicle area. In order to have additional drivers close by in case something went wrong, I picked a location in the center of the group. I secured my load, finished my post-trip inspection, and got comfortable for what he thought it would be a peaceful night's sleep. I was completing some paperwork and was ready to get into my sleeper berth at around 10:15 when I saw a dark blue vehicle arrive into the rest area. Cars were frequently seen at truck rest spots, particularly during the night time when families were making long trips. However, there was something about this specific car that drew my eye. It circled the truck parking area slowly, weaving amongst the parked semis as if searching for something, rather than parking in the authorized vehicle spot. The vehicle drove around the truck parking lot 3 times before coming to a stop where it could see every truck parked there without being seen. Through the tinted windows, I could not see the driver clearly, but I could see that he was by himself and seemed to be methodically observing the vehicles. I decided to monitor the scenario and mentally noted the number plate number. The sedan departed the rest area about 20 minutes later, and I figured the driver had just been disoriented or perplexed by the parking arrangements. I forgot about the experience and went to bed. However, the same dark blue sedan was parked somewhere else, still in a position that allowed it to see the truck parking lot. When I woke up 4 hours later to use the lavatory, I had a gut feeling that something was off this time. I strolled across to the lavatory facility, and on my way back to my truck, I saw that the driver of the sedan had exited his car. He was an average height, middle-aged man who was hard to notice in the darkness between the trucks because of his dark clothes. He was moving slowly across the parking lot, examining each truck closely, paying close attention to the corporate logos and license plates. He went straight back to his car and drove off when he noticed that I was observing him. When I got up 2 hours later to make sure my luggage was secure before continuing my journey, I saw the automobile for the 3rd time. It was parked somewhere else again, but it was still in a position to see the vehicles. The driver stayed this time in his car, but I could see him looking at the trucks more intently through what looked like binoculars. I made the decision to report suspicious activity by calling 911 at that point. After receiving my information, the state police dispatcher informed me that an officer would not be able to attend for at least half an hour, but they would send a patrol car to check on the rest area. I made the decision not to wait. I hurriedly finished my pre-trip examination and resumed driving on the interstate, reasoning that I didn't want to be present for whatever the sedan driver had planned. I was mistaken to believe that was the end of it. 50 miles down the road, I noticed the same dark blue vehicle in my rearview mirror, precisely matching my speed and remaining approximately a quarter of a mile behind me. It also slowed down when I did. It increased speed when I did. It took a few seconds for it to change lanes after I did. The fact that I was being followed was obvious. I experimented with a number of methods to lose the tail and validate my findings. After driving around the ramp and taking an exit, I returned to the highway. I was followed the whole way by the car. The vehicle parked across the street and waited as I pulled into a truck stop for fuel. It continued to follow me at the same distance when I exited the truck stop. For almost 200 meters, this pattern persisted throughout Nebraska and into Iowa. By daybreak, I was very terrified. This was neither a coincidence or a random road behavior. Someone was purposefully following me around with a degree of tenacity that betrayed grave criminal intent. I conveyed the problem to my dispatcher over the phone, and he recommended that I drive straight to our company terminal in Des Moines, where security would be there and other drivers might assist if needed. I believed I might be able to lose my pursuer in the traffic. It got heavier as I got closer to the Des Moines metropolitan region. However, the car driver was tenacious and competent, preserving eye contact despite the dozens of other cars separating us. Whoever was following me obviously had surveillance experience and was not going to give up lightly. I contacted 911 once more and reported that I was being followed by someone who seemed to be doing it illegally. The state of Iowa police dispatcher told me to pull into a way station just outside of Des Moines, where policemen were on duty and could help me right away. With the sedan still a quarter of a mile behind, I did as they said and pulled into the way station. The vehicle vanished as soon as I pulled into the way station. It was in my mirrors one moment, and then it was gone, as if the driver had foreseen my move and taken evasive behavior. Despite the absence of the suspicious vehicle, the state police officers were quite professional and treated my report seriously. They were limited to recording the occurrence and telling me to stay vigilant. I proceeded to my business terminal in Inde. I told my safety director about the event in one and gave a thorough account of the sedan and its driver. I discovered something that chilled me to the bone that afternoon. Over the previous month, 2 other drivers from my firm had reported similar experiences, both involving long-distance pursuits by dark blue sedans on Interstate 80. The following had ceased in both situations when the drivers either called for assistance or arrived in populous areas. I was informed that I was now a part of a much wider investigation after the safety director got in touch with the FBI. Long-haul truckers hauling valuable cargo with a focus of what federal officials thought to be an organized criminal cell. At rest locations, the group would look for possible victims at truck stops, track them to find out their itineraries and schedules, and then work with other criminals to rob the trucks at sites that are remote. The FBI detained 5 men 3 weeks after my event in relation to a truck hijacking group that had been active in several states. It turned out that the dark blue sedan that had been pursuing me was one of the group's many surveillance cars. The FBI claims that because I had identified the threat early and taken the necessary precautions to protect myself, I'd escaped being a victim. According to the inquiry, the criminal organization stole more than $2 million worth of cargo during at least 12 truck hijackings over a 6-month period. During the robberies, a number of drivers had severe injuries, and one motorist in Kansas had been battered by the hijackers and admitted to the hospital for a week. The organization used the rest sites and truck stops along Interstate 80 as hunting grounds to find possible victims, focusing on drivers who drove alone on well-traveled routes. The man who had followed me that night was put on trial, and I testified. He received a 15-year sentence in federal prison after being found guilty of conspiring to commit robbery. I discovered during the trial that he had been pursuing me for over 300 meters, anticipating that I would halt in a remote spot so that his accomplices could finish the heist. Had I failed to ask for assistance after seeing his surveillance, I would have turned into another figure in their illegal business. I now approach every facet of trucking safety differently as a result of the experience. No matter how exhausted I am, I no longer take sporadic rest breaks in remote areas. Whenever feasible, I change my routes and timetables to avoid settling into a pattern. I always look in my mirrors to see if there are any cars following me, and I follow my gut when anything doesn't feel right. Above all, whenever I suspect criminal conduct, I never think twice about calling law authorities. The FBI representative who dealt with me. According to the case, truck drivers are particularly targeted by predators because we frequently travel alone, transport important goods, and exhibit recognizable patterns that make us simple to trace and ambush. According to him, the highways provide easy access to victims, several escape routes, and a steady stream of possible targets, making them ideal hunting grounds for crooks. He clarified that early danger detection is essential to remain secure, and acting right away to seek assistance. Even now, 6 months later, whenever I stop into a rest area, I still think about that dark blue vehicle. When I drive at night, I still frantically check my mirrors. Still, if I notice anything, I dial 911. Even if it proves to be nothing suspicious. Because I discovered that paranoia is not a weakness in the trucking industry. It's a skill for survival. When a driver lets their guard down, predators are waiting for them, and the only way to be safe is to be aware that, if you are not vigilant, every stop can be your last. I learnt from mile marker 247 that complacency is the most hazardous load a truck driver can transport. When you begin to think that nothing negative will ever happen to you, that's the instant you become a simple target for those who make a profession by hunting drivers. That night, I was fortunate, but luck isn't. Plan. It is vigilance. I am not proud of some of the things I have done while traveling. I've taken shortcuts and broken the rules. However, I learnt that some debts follow you forever from what transpired during my deadhead run from Phoenix. I've been a truck driver for 28 years, and my name is Frank Rodriguez. I believed that I was aware of all the legal and unwritten traffic laws during that time. I believed I understood the distinction between doing what was required and doing what was morally good, between conscience and survival. I was completely mistaken. 7 years have passed since the event that altered everything. However, it seems like yesterday. I was regularly transporting construction equipment from Houston to Phoenix every time I closed my eyes. The load and the journey are not particularly noteworthy. In January, the Southwest saw exceptionally severe weather, with ice storms and freezing rain making driving in Texas and New Mexico extremely dangerous. Due to road closures, I was already 2 days behind schedule, and my dispatcher was putting a lot of pressure on me to deliver the cargo on time. That delivery runs last night. I was traveling roughly 50 miles outside of Van Horn, along a particularly remote section of Interstate 10 in western Texas. It was past midnight. Black ice covered the roadways, and cold fog that had rolled in from the desert made it difficult to see. I ought to have halted and waited for better circumstances. However, I pushed because I was so near my target and so fed up with delays. Despite my better judgment, I went forward. I noticed the headlights in my mirrors at that point. For the last 20 meters, a little automobile had been following me, staying considerably back, but keeping the same speed. I wouldn't have thought much about it under normal conditions, but the way the car was swerving a little bit back and forth gave me the impression that the driver might be struggling with the icy conditions. I monitored the automobile, wishing the person behind the wheel would reach their destination safely. Around 1:30 in the morning, I noticed the car's headlights begin to shake more dramatically as I was getting closer to a very hazardous, accident-prone downhill portion. The car was obviously losing control on the ice, slithering across the lanes in a manner that suggested the driver was overcorrecting in a panic. In the hopes that they would regain control before a horrible incident occurred, I slowed down and shifted to the left lane to give them space. However, they were unable to regain control. The automobile went into full spin, spun around twice, and then slammed sideways into the concrete barrier between the eastbound and westbound lanes while I watched in my mirrors. There was a metallic crunch that made my stomach spin, and the collision was so strong that I could hear it over the sound of my engine and the road. The vehicle steam rose from what was remained of the car, and headlights went out instantly. As fast as I could, I pulled over to the shoulder and retrieved my torch and emergency pack. I could tell that the driver's side of the car had been hit the worst as I dashed back towards the debris. The windscreen was spiderwebbed. The door had collapsed and the highway was already littered with shattered glass. When I arrived at the car, Andy noticed a young woman sprawled over the driving wheel with blood on her forehead, obviously unconscious, but still breathing, as I shone my torch through the passenger window. I quickly dialed 911 and provided them with the accident's location and details. The dispatcher informed me that it would take at least 45 minutes for an ambulance to arrive at our location, because emergency services were already handling many weather-related collisions. She suggested that I remain with the victim and make an effort to keep her calm and warm till assistance came. With the intention of helping in any way I could, I returned to my truck to retrieve blankets and a first aid kit. I became aware of my cargo at that point, a small crane that was not securely fastened in accordance with federal requirements, was among the construction equipment I was transporting. To keep the load profile lower, I had been running overweight and had employed shortened chains, both of which were infractions that, if found out during a routine inspection, might result in the loss of my commercial driver's license. I had taken shortcuts in my rush to make up time, which could now ruin my career. As part of their routine accident investigation protocols, the responding cops would most likely want to check my car if I remained at the site. They would find the weight violations and incorrect load securement, which would lead to severe fines, perhaps criminal charges, and an instant suspension of my CDL. I have a mortgage to pay, a family to provide for, and no other abilities that would enable me to make a similar salary. Everything I have worked so hard to achieve over the past 20 years would be destroyed by a single error or moment of bad load securement judgment. I stood there in the chilly rain, glancing between my truck and the smashed car, conflicted between upholding my moral principles and preserving my capacity to support my family. The woman in the automobile appeared stable and was breathing. There was help coming. Without my help, she could be all right. It is possible that if I was not directly engaged in the accident, the responding officers would not investigate my truck. Perhaps before or anyone noticed, I could continue to Phoenix, deliver my load, and resolve the securement problems. The worst choice of my life was the one I made. I made my way back to my truck, climbed in, and drove off. I assured myself that emergency personnel were already en route, that the woman would get the care she needed, and that my presence would not have a major impact on her prognosis. I persuaded myself that staying at the site of an accident in which I was not formally involved was not as vital as preserving my family's financial stability. I spent the next 3 hours searching for information on the accident on every news website and radio station I could find as I traveled into Phoenix in the dark. I took the fact that I couldn't find anything as a sign. Since there were no fatalities, the woman had lived and would get better. Feeling bad, but certain that I had taken the most sensible decision, I delivered my load the following morning, fixed the securement problems on my empty trailer, and began the deadhead run back to Houston. During that fruitless journey back, the guilt started to consume me. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman hunched over her steering wheel, breathing but powerless, with blood on her forehead. Each mile marker served as a reminder that I was leaving behind someone who had needed aid, someone I could have shielded and consoled as she awaited medical attention. I sought to use the possible outcomes I had avoided as justification for my choice. However, I knew in my heart that I had failed a basic human decency test. I began to notice things that didn't make sense around 6 hours into the return trip, while I was traveling down the same section of highway where the tragedy had happened. The time was now mid-afternoon. The roads were dry and the weather had cleared. However, I thought I might be seeing ice patches in my side vision. The road surface looked normal every time I looked at it straight, but I kept seeing glimmers of freezing fog and black ice in my passenger window and in my side mirrors. I initially noticed her in my mirrors at that time. A young woman in the same attire I recognized from the accident scene was standing on the highway shoulder. Her forehead was still covered in blood as she stood there immobile, watching my truck drive by. She had vanished when I looked again. I persuaded myself that my conscience was deceiving my weary mind, that guilt and sleep deprivation were causing me to have hallucinations, and that I was seeing things. However, 10 miles later, she reappeared, this time standing in the median between the eastbound and westbound lanes roughly, where her vehicle had been involved in an accident. This time, she was more visible, and I could see that her clothes were bloody and ripped, that her neck was hunched at an odd angle, and that her eyes were tracking my truck as I went by, her mouth twitching as if she were trying to convey something. I couldn't hear above the sound of my engine. She held up one hand and pointed straight at me. I attempted to explain it away by telling myself that I was seeing a different woman who just so happened to look like the accident victim. But I knew something unusual was going on when she showed up a third time, standing right in my lane about a quarter of a mile ahead. This time, she was considerably more specific, and I could detect injuries that had not been apparent at the time of the event. There were obvious fractures in her head. Blood was seeping through her clothes in patterns that suggested internal bleeding, and her left arm dangled at an unimaginable angle, about 50 feet away from her. I used the brakes and stopped completely. She approached my truck slowly, her motions jerky and awkward, as if she were attempting to make her body work after suffering serious spinal damage. Although I was still unable to hear her through my closed windows, I could see that her lips were moving continuously as she drew closer, repeating the same phrases again and over. She put both of her hands against my truck when she arrived, windscreen, and fixed my eyes with his. She had a frigid, pallid face. Her mouth was still working with urgent intensity, and her eyes were bloodshot and full of tears. Reading her lips as she repeated the same phrase over and over again, I finally grasped what she was trying to tell me. "You abandoned me to perish. You abandoned me to perish." When I attempted to start my truck and leave, the engine refused to start. I attempted calling for assistance on my CB radio, but all I heard was static. Even though I was in an area where I knew there were numerous towers, I tried using my cell phone but had no coverage. I was confined by myself with the spirit of a woman whose passing I seemed to be in charge of. She walked around to the driver's side of my truck and got up upon the running board, putting her face against my glass. She was obviously dead, yet her breath started to fog up the glass. Like she was banging on a door, she repeatedly and slowly tapped on the pane with one finger. A tiny patch of blood appeared on the glass after each tap, and she had uttered a single word after a few minutes: "Murderer." It was at that point that I realized the full scope of my actions. The accident had not claimed this woman's life immediately. She had been waiting for the assistance I had promised to bring, had survived the initial impact, and was alert and conscious when I discovered her. However, she had passed away after I departed due to internal injuries that could have been avoided with prompt medical care. She had passed away in agony, alone, and wondering why the truck driver who had pulled over to assist her had vanished out of thin air. The ghost got out of my truck and made his way back to the front of it. I will never forget the mix of anguish and anger in her eyes as she stood there looking at me for what seemed like hours. Then she opened her mouth and let out a scream, so loud and agonized that I could hear it plainly over the sound of my idling engine and through my closed windows. The music carried on for what seemed like forever. A wave of utter hopelessness and indictment that appeared to arrive simultaneously from all sides. She was gone when the yelling eventually ceased and my truck got started without any problems. I didn't even turn on the radio and drove the rest of the way back to Houston in total silence. I did something I had never done in my professional life when I went home. I looked into the accident I had seen. I became physically ill after discovering what I did in the local newspaper archives. Maria Santos was her name. She was a 23-year-old University of Texas nursing student who was traveling home to El Paso to see her relatives. At 1:47 a.m., the accident had happened, and around 3:15 a.m., a highway maintenance crew had found her. She had been cognizant and alert at first, but the medical examiner's report states that she had internal bleeding from the impact. She had passed away about 20 minutes before the maintenance team discovered her, so she would still be alive if I had stayed with her, phoned for assistance sooner, and administered basic first aid. Investigators were searching for a truck driver who had been spotted in the area, according to the newspaper report. Someone who may have seen what transpired or who may have knowledge of the road conditions at the time of the accident. I never came forward, therefore they never found me. I could have given them important details about the situation, but instead I let them to close the case as a weather-related single-car collision. Maria Santos has shown up in my travels dozens of times since that day. I've made enough trips, not all of them, to be able to spot the warning flags. The sudden breakdown of my phone and radio communications, the icy fog and summer heat, and the patches of ice that form on clear days. She always shows up with the same accusation in her eyes, pointing at me while wearing the same clothing and suffering the same injuries. She occasionally writes the word murderer, always the same phrase on my windscreen. I tried rerouting and completely avoiding that section of the highway, but it made no difference. Anywhere on any route at any time, she can locate me. I've seen her in my own driveway in Houston, on city streets in Florida, and at truck stops in Montana. She's only connected to me because of my cowardice and her passing. She is not constrained by location or reason. I finally took the action I should have taken 3 years ago. I called the police department in El Paso and told them about my participation in the mishap. I told them everything. How I located Maria, how I requested assistance, and how I left her behind in order to safeguard my professional reputation. I gave a thorough statement, allowed myself to be questioned, and gave their investigators my whole cooperation. My case was handled by a caring but truthful detective. He assisted me in getting in touch with Maria's family, and I was able to personally apologize to them for failing their daughter when she most needed assistance, even though the statute of limitations had passed on the majority of possible charges, and there was no proof that my presence would have prevented Maria's injuries. Using every cent I had saved during my trucking career, I created a scholarship fund at the University of Texas Nursing School in Maria's honor. But her ghost doesn't care about any of it. I still see her as frequently as before, still makes the same claim and points at me. She still uses her bloody fingers to write murder on my windows, because she and I both know that the basic reality cannot be altered by money or legal jargon. My profession was more important to me than saving the life of a dying woman, so I left her alone on a cold highway. I'm no longer a truck driver. I couldn't keep working in a field where every step reminded me of my shortcomings and where every accident scene reminded me of the decision I made that evening. Currently, I attend to emergency calls and offer medical assistance to anyone in need as a volunteer. I'm making an effort to strike a balance and save as many lives as I can, because I didn't rescue one life, but I am aware that it will never be sufficient, because Maria Santos is always there, pointing at me with her bloody finger whenever I look in the mirror. see a reflection in a window, or witness a puddle, telling me that certain mistakes are permanent and that some debts are unpayable. Now that I'm 62, I'll use my remaining years to try to atone for a transgression that will always be remembered. The ghosts of the individuals we fail to save when we put ourselves before others are far more merciless than the road itself. Maria Santos is now my constant companion, and a reminder that when my character was truly put to the test, I chose cowardice over courage and self-interest over sacrifice. I will always remember that decision throughout my life, and it will be evident in every reflection, audible in every silence, and present in every situation where I have the chance to help someone else and have to choose between stopping and continuing to drive. Nothing compares to running with a strong convoy. The protection, the companionship, and the radio stories that were shared. However, I joined a convoy outside of Amarillo that wasn't seeking companionship. Souls were what they sought. I've been driving long distance for 16 years, and my name is Paul Carter. Over the years, I've discovered that the road may be a lonely location, particularly when you're traveling in the desert 4 hours at a time and don't see anyone. For this reason, the majority of drivers value the chance to travel with other trucks in order to be safe and social. I learnt not to join such convoys after what occurred to me on Highway 287 north of Amarillo. I was transporting a lot of furniture from Dallas to Denver during the third week of November. I was traveling through the Texas Panhandle at a great pace, with bright skies and minimal traffic throughout the day. I heard some talk on Channel 19 about a convoy forming up outside Amarillo at approximately 8:30 p.m., when the sun was just about to drop behind me. As they ran through southeastern Colorado and northeastern New Mexico, the lead driver was urging any trucks heading north to join them. The voice on the radio belonged to a man who identified himself as Big Jake. He had the tone of a seasoned driver, composed and authoritative from decades of driving. In order to form a good convoy for the overnight travel, he clarified, they already had 5 trucks and were searching for a couple more. Safety and numbers, he remarked, particularly on the desolate sections where there were very few truck stops. It seemed like a great chance to go with seasoned drivers who were familiar with the road. I pressed the record button and requested further information. Big Jake got back to me very away, telling me where they were staging and how I could join the formation. According to him, they would leave at precisely 9:15, travel at a constant speed of 70 miles per hour, and remain together until they arrived at the truck stop in Wrighton, New Mexico, at around midnight. I wanted to go in a convoy, and this one sounded professional and well organized. I was impressed by what I observed when I discovered the staging area at a sizable truck stop on the northern outskirts of Amarillo. Indeed, a formation of 5 vehicles was already in place. They are all spotless, well-kept vehicles that appear to be owned by serious professional drivers. The lead truck was a vintage Peterbilt 379 with chrome stacks and a tall hood, the type of vehicle that vintage drivers take care in keeping up. Behind it were an International 9900, a Max Superliner, a Freightliner Classic, and a Kenworth W900. They're all in great shape and seem to be from the 1990s. I approached Big Jake to introduce myself after pulling up behind the International. However, the driver was not visible in the cab as I got close to the lead truck. I assumed that before leaving, he was most likely inside the truck stop taking care of some business. I entered in the hopes of meeting some of the other drivers and getting a cup of coffee. However, I couldn't find anyone who fit the characteristics of the convoy drivers I had seen outside as I searched around the truck stop. I inquired about the convoy that was gathering in the parking lot from the young woman who worked at the fuel station. She seemed amiable enough. She asked me what convoy I was referring to. Looking perplexed, as I gestured towards the window, the 5 followed my eyes as the trucks formed a queue, then gave me a perplexed look in return. She remarked, "I only see your truck out there. Are you feeling all right? I asked myself as I glanced out the window once more. The 5 trucks were still there, arranged just as they had been when I got there. The clerk's allegation that she was unable to see them baffled me, however. I figured she was either not listening or was focusing on the incorrect area of the parking lot. I stepped back outside to wait for departure time after thanking her for her time. I heard Big Jake's voice on the radio requesting that the convoy disperse at precisely 9:15. As I watched, the 5 trucks in front of me fired up and started to drive towards the highway entrance. After starting my own rig, I followed them, positioning myself as the 6th truck in the arrangement. Big Jake called on the radio to greet me to the convoy and go over the itinerary as we turned into Highway 287 North. Everything appeared to be perfectly normal for the first hour, with proper vehicle spacing and a constant speed of 70 miles per hour. The convoy kept flawless formation. On the radio, the other drivers were polite and professional, exchanging data regarding traffic patterns and road conditions, thankful to be traveling with seasoned drivers who obviously knew what they were doing. I started to unwind and enjoy the company. However, as we ventured more into the New Mexico desert, I began to notice some oddities. We had not passed another car in either way in more than an hour of driving at 70 miles per hour. Even though Highway 287 was not a busy route, it was uncommon to see no traffic at all for such a long time. Despite the fact that it was now pitch black outside, I also observed that none of the other trucks in the convoy had activated their headlights. I turned on my radio at around 10:30 to question Big Jake about the absence of headlights. You might want to remind the guys to switch on their lights. Big Jake, this place is getting really gloomy. The reaction I received chilled me to the bone. A hollow echoing sound, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well, replaced Big Jake's familiar voice on the radio. Paul, we're heading somewhere that doesn't require lights. Even in the dark, our vision is excellent. I had never introduced myself to anyone in the convoy. When I had contacted them, I had not given my name to anyone and had instead used my CB handle, Lonia. Big Jake, however, somehow recognized me. During my previous radio communication with my dispatcher, I tried to convince myself that he had somehow overheard my name, but I knew that was impossible because I had been using separate channels. I turned to face the 5 trucks ahead of me and saw that none of them had any lights at all. There are no headlights, marker lights, tail lights, or anything else. With the exception of their shadows against a somewhat lighter sky, they were entirely invisible as they traveled through the night like ghost ships. I made an effort to get a closer look at the vehicles, but each time I concentrated on one, it appeared to fade and become less distinct, both inside and outside of reality. I saw something at that point that caused me to doubt my own sanity. We had spent almost an hour on Highway 287 heading north. However, my GPS indicated that we were still exactly where we had begun. The same numerals appeared on the mile markers. We were crossing over and over again repeatedly, as if we were stuck in a loop that stopped us from moving forward in any meaningful way. I attempted using the corporate radio to transmit my whereabouts to my dispatcher, but all I heard was static. Even though I was in an area where I knew there were numerous towers, I tried using my cell phone, but it showed no signal. I traveled in formation with 5 vehicles that might not even be real, and I was totally isolated from the outer world, on a motorway that didn't appear to lead somewhere. When Big Jake's voice returned to the radio, it sounded different, like the whine through a deserted building, less human. Paul, I'm having second thoughts and questioning whether joining our small convoy was the proper move. It's too late now. Once you participated in a journey with us forever. Brotherhood. I slammed on my brakes in fear when I noticed something in my mirrors. There was a never-ending queue of trucks behind my truck, as far back as I could see. In the dark, they followed the same unfeasible path through the New Mexico desert. Dozens or even hundreds of them, all without lights, dotted a convoy of 6. I was no longer the 6th truck. For God knows how long, this route had been traversed by countless trucks, of which I was one. Modern rigs were different from the trucks I saw in my mirrors when I first joined. These were vintage cars from various times, some of which appeared to be from the 1950s and 1960s. There were vintage Max and Peterbilts with chrome bumpers and tall hoods, international harvesters that should have been in museums, with bulldog ornamentation. They were all propelled by figures I couldn't quite identify. Dark shapes behind windscreens that didn't reflect any light. My truck did not obey my orders to slow down and pull over to the shoulder in an attempt to break formation. It had the steering wheel locked in place. The brakes refused to apply. Additionally, the accelerator appeared to be acting independently. I was powerless to flee from whatever supernatural force was directing our journey, so I was stuck in the convoy and had to go at the same speed as the other vehicles. Once more, Big Jake's voice filled my taxi. However, other voices now joined it, dozens of them, all using the same hollow echoing tone while speaking simultaneously. "Paul, welcome to the everlasting convoy. We have been anticipating your arrival. Since our heart attacks, accidents, and several driving-related deaths, we have been using these highways. Until we arrive at our destination, we cannot relax, and, without new drivers to take the place of those who eventually fade away, we cannot arrive at our target. That's when I realized what I had joined. There were no living drivers in this caravan. These were the specters of truck drivers who had perished while out on the road, destined to roam the night for all eternity in search of other drivers to join them. Their souls were those of men who had died in accidents, robberies, and mechanical failures, who had fallen asleep at the wheel and crashed, who had experienced heart attacks while walking down long hallways. They were stuck in a never-ending cycle, driving the same route night after night, unable to get any sleep until they were able to find substitute drivers. The voices kept coming over my radio, telling me of their deaths and the illnesses and accidents that had taken their life while they were operating a motor vehicle. In 1987, Big Jake passed away from a heart attack close to Raiden. In 1993, the Kenworth's driver crashed into a bridge abutment while dozing off. In 1998, the Freightliner driver was shot during a heist. They had all been sentenced to keep driving until they could find someone to replace them after each of them died alone while driving. I made every effort to escape the convoy that sprang to mind. I said a prayer. I let out a yell. I even attempted to switch off my engine, but it was unsuccessful. The truck kept going forward on its own electricity, driving across the desert darkness in the never-ending queue of ghost cars. My gasoline gauge began to decrease towards empty. However, the truck continued to run, as though it were propelled by the same unearthly force that governed the entire convoy. Days or even hours went by. I was unable to tell. In the procession of the dead, time appeared to have no significance. There was an infinite repetition of the same mall signs. Past my windows, I could see the same desolate terrain. Through my radio, the same voices murmured about death and endless enslavement. I started to feel as though the convoy was gradually turning me from a living driver into another ghost truck. I was about to give up until I recalled something my grandfather had told me years before he passed away. He had cautioned me about the perils of the road that extended beyond mechanical breakdowns and inclement weather, because he had been a truck driver himself in the 1960s and 1970s. He had advised me to concentrate on my loved ones, the life I had waiting for me when I returned home, and the reasons I had for living if I ever found myself in any peril while driving. My wife Jennifer and our 2 small children were waiting for me to return from this vacation, and I thought about them. I considered our upcoming summer trip, the Christmas gifts I had promised to purchase them, and all the typical amazing moments of family life that awaited me in the real world. I concentrated on their laughing, their voices, their features, and everything else that made me feel a part of the living world. I started to regain control of my truck gradually. My grip on the steering wheel relaxed. I was able to slow down and pull over to the highway shoulder when the brakes began to respond. The fleet of ghost trucks continued by me as I stared through my mirrors, their drivers turning to gaze at me with jealous, empty eyes before vanishing into the night. For perhaps 10 minutes, I perched on the shoulder, trembling and attempting to comprehend what had simply occurred to me. I returned to the highway and headed for the closest truck stop. Once I was well enough to carry on, my GPS indicated that I was not trapped in the never-ending loop I had encountered while in the convoy, but rather exactly where I should have been given the time and distance I had travelled. I asked the written truck stop receptionist whether she had heard any rumours about accidents or convoys in the region. She informed me that over the years, a number of truckers had reported seeing ghost trucks moving in formation across the desert on Highway 287, which was known locally as the Phantom Highway. She claimed that although the majority of people wrote the stories off as hallucinations brought on by loneliness and exhaustion, she had heard enough similar experiences to think that there was something supernatural going on along that particular stretch of road. My trip to Denver ended without any more problems. However, I will always remember my encounter with the convoy of the dead. I never travel at night, but I do occasionally drive Highway 287 when my routes demand it, and I never answer radio calls about convoys gathering nearby because I know that Big Jake and his everlasting convoy are still traveling in the dark, still looking for drivers to join them, still stuck in their never-ending trek through the night of the desert. There is a true brotherhood of the road. However, not every brotherhood is intended for living people. Some convoys contain drivers who are already dead and can never make it to their destination, traveling roadways that transcend time and space. Fortunately, I managed to get away from the dead convoy. However, I am aware that other drivers haven't had the same luck. Each time I hear a call on the CB radio regarding joining a convoy, Big Jake's admonition comes to mind every time I see a queue of trucks moving in the dark without lights. You travel with us permanently after you join the Brotherhood. Despite careful maintenance and defensive driving, there are many hazards on the road that cannot be avoided. Certain risks are paranormal, and the only defense against them is bond with love and life that keeps us grounded in the living world. I had to learn that the hard way. I hope I never have to learn it again, as I did during my night with the convoy of the dead, more times than I can remember. Rex's vehicle repair on Highway 50 saved my bacon. Every driver was treated like family by Rex. That's why finding his workshop in the basement was so much worse. For 12 years, I, Tommy Garrett, have been transporting goods between Kansas City and Denver. Rex Morrison, who operated a little truck repair shop in the middle of nowhere between Dodge City and Garden City, Kansas, was the only mechanic I trusted in all that time. He didn't have a luxurious apartment, only a little office and a few service bays. However, anything with wheels and an engine could be fixed by Rex. Rex was the type of mechanic that every truck driver hopes to come across: trustworthy, knowledgeable, and ready for urgent repairs around the clock. He always got you back on the road as soon as possible, charged reasonable pricing, and never tried to sell you parts you didn't need. Throughout the years, he had been out of more tight spots than I can remember. You name it: blown tires, gearbox troubles, electrical malfunctions, engine problems, etc. And I had it fixed by Rex. For drivers who traveled that desolate section of the Kansas highway, he was like a protecting angel. Because of this, I never questioned Rex's business practices or the reason his shop, although being in a remote area, was usually so busy. I never questioned why. Before ever looking under the hood, he seemed to know exactly what was wrong with trucks or what made him urge that drivers stay overnight in his customer lounge rather than going on to the closest truck stop. I almost lost everything because I had total faith in Rex. I was transporting farm equipment from Kansas City to Colorado Springs on a chilly February night when the event that exposed Rex's true character occurred. I was feeling proud of myself for completing an early delivery and was ahead of schedule when my truck began to make a grinding noise I had never heard before. Every mile made it worse, and it was emanating from someplace in the drivetrain. I was aware that I might be facing a serious breakdown in the middle of nowhere if I did not have it checked out right now. I limped the truck to Rex's shop, which was still 40 miles away, instead of taking the chance of phoning an unknown person for roadside assistance. Around 10:30 that evening, I pulled into his lot, and before I could even turn off my engine, Rex came out to welcome me, even though he was sporting his typical boiler suit and a warm smile. There was something off about his face that evening. It was more calculated and intense than I had ever witnessed, even though he was already circling my truck as if he were doing an inspection. He inquired, "What brings you by, Tommy?" "Got some kind of grinding noise in the drivetrain," I replied. Rex nodded thoughtfully and slipped behind my truck with a torch, saying, "Started about an hour ago, and it is getting worse." 2 minutes or so later, he came out, shaking his head and wearing a furrowed brow. "Houston, you have a serious disparity issue. The ring and pinion gears are destroyed, and the drive shaft coupling is totally shot. You're fortunate to have survived this ordeal without losing your entire rear end." It didn't sound cheap, and it didn't sound good. How long will it take to fix? Witcher will have to supply parts, and I probably won't be able to obtain them until Monday morning because of the upcoming weekend. After I have everything I need, I estimate that it will take me 6 to 8 hours of work. You should allow at least 3 or 4 days. 4 days would have ruined my delivery plan and most likely cost me the contract. But my options were limited. A collision on Highway 50 in winter can be fatal, and the only certified mechanic within 100 miles was Rex. Rex dismissed my offer that we seek a motel room in town, where I agreed to leave the truck with him. "Tani, there's no need to pay for a motel. I have a kitchen and a bed in my customer lounge. You are welcome to remain here as long as necessary. Just a portion of the service, no fee." Rex's customer lounge was actually pretty pleasant, better than most truck stop driver lounges, with a real bed instead of simply a cot, a small refrigerator, and a television with good reception. I had been there previously during repairs. Another reason that everyone praised Rex's company was that he had always been generous in allowing drivers to use the facilities while he undertook lengthy repairs. I anticipated a dull but comfortable few days of waiting for parts, so I took my personal items into the lounge and settled in. I wouldn't be entirely alone, because Rex lived in a tiny flat above his business, but the place was so isolated that my only options were to read, watch TV, and wait for my truck to be ready. After explaining the situation to my dispatcher over the phone, I made every effort to minimize the inconvenience of the delay. It was a trouble-free first night. Rex took me to a local diner for dinner. We discussed the weather and vehicles, and I went around 11 o'clock. I went to bed, thankful that my rig was being maintained by such a trustworthy mechanic. I slept better than I had in weeks, and the customer lounge was cozy and peaceful. However, on the second night, I began to hear odd sounds coming from underneath the store. Rex frequently worked on trucks late into the night. Thus it was not unusual for the sound to be that of machinery operating. However, these noises were distinct from the typical sounds made by hydraulic lifts and air tools. They were mechanical and rhythmic, resembling some sort of manufacturing machinery that had no place in a truck repair business. When I woke up at around 2 in the morning to use the loo, I saw light coming from a basement entry that I had never seen previously. It was partially obscured by a pile of view tires behind Rex's office. I could see stairs heading down into what seemed like a well-lit underground workspace, and the door was slightly ajar. The mechanic Ollie could hear what sounded like voices conversing, and the noises were considerably louder close to the door. My initial assumption was that Rex had called in another mechanic to assist him because he was working on a particularly challenging repair. However, upon closer inspection, I discovered that the voices were not talking about auto repair. They were discussing transport routes, scheduling, and what they kept calling harvesting operations. The tone was professional and businesslike. However, the topic was nonsensical in a truck maintenance shop setting. Curiosity overcame me, and I should have returned to the lounge and kept to myself. In order to see what Rex was doing downstairs at 2 o'clock in the morning, I slipped as stealthily as possible down the basement steps, remaining hidden in the darkness. Everything I believed to be true about the man who had been repairing my vehicles for more than 10 years was altered by what I learnt. The basement extended much beyond the building's footprint and was significantly larger than the business above it. It was arranged like an advanced production plant, complete with industrial machinery that didn't belong under a truck repair shop in the country. There were welding stations, metal cutting equipment, hydraulic presses, and what seemed like a small metal melting foundry. What Rex was producing, however, was the most unsettling aspect. Numerous metal plates, each with the registration details and identifying numbers of several lorries, were arranged along one wall. These weren't authentic license plates or replacement pieces. These were fakes intended to alter the identity of automobiles for illicit activities. Rex did more than fix trucks. He was changing them, giving cars that were most likely stolen or being used illegally new names. However, that wasn't the worst thing I saw in that workshop in the basement. I recognized the vehicle that Rex and 2 other men were repairing. In the middle of the room, it was owned by Carl Madison, a driver who had 3 weeks prior. It had stopped at Rex's shop due to gearbox issues. Carl's rig was still here, being disassembled and rebuilt with fake license plates, although he was meant to have picked up his repaired truck and gone on to his destination. As I took a closer look around the basement, I saw that the workplace was littered with parts and components from dozens of various trucks. Cargo trailers, engines, and transmissions all have the logos of reputable trucking businesses on them, but clearly taken from cars that had been hijacked or stolen. Rex was not operating a genuine repair business. He was running a chop shop and vehicle theft business, luring unwary drivers into his trap by posing as an honest technician. At that moment, I became aware of the most horrific detail. Personal items were hidden in the darkness in a corner of the basement. That was obviously not Rex's or his friend's property. Cell phones, wallets, driver's licenses, and other objects that appeared to have been stolen from truck drivers. Each of the at least 20 sets of personal belongings I counted represented a driver who had sought assistance from Rex and had never left. I discovered that Rex had been deliberately going after lone long-haul trucks on remote roads. He would use sabotage to cripple their trucks, make them come to him for assistance, and then make them vanish while robbing them of their rigs and goods. Drivers that were stranded were not given access to the client lounge. The victims were detained in a holding cell while Rex made a decision about how to handle them. With my heart thumping so loudly that I was certain Rex would hear it, I backed up the stairs as discreetly as possible. I had to go right away, but my truck was disabled, and there was no connection on my cell phone in this remote area. I was stuck with a man who had been killing truck drivers for years, alone and defenseless in the middle of nowhere, just like all of Rex's past victims. After returning to the client lounge undetected, I attempted to devise a plan of escape. It was too far to go across open fields in the dark to the closest town, which was 8 miles distant. If I attempted to go on foot, Rex would notice right away because his shop was the only structure 4 miles in either direction. I had to figure out how to either disable Rex's operation before he knew I had figured out his secret. I found a large torch that might be used as a club if needed after searching the customer lounge for anything I could use as a weapon. In addition, I discovered a set of wire cutters that Rex had left behind from earlier repairs, which I could use to damage his machinery, but I knew it would be suicide to go straight up to Rex. He would not think twice about including me in his collection of drivers he has slain. At least 20 of them. My only option was to disrupt his operation and get away while he was coping with the fallout. By 4 o'clock in the morning, when Rex and his friends had finally fallen asleep, I sneaked back down to the basement. I disabled all the electrical equipment I could discover with the wire cutters, working as silently as possible. I destroyed as much of the forging equipment as I could without creating noise, cut power lines, and damaged control panels. Then I discovered something that truly opened my eyes to the scope of Rex's illegal enterprise. Records of several truck thefts dating back more than 15 years were concealed in a lockable filing cabinet that I was able to pry open. Rex was well versed in delivery routes, cargo manifests, and driver timetables. He was more than just an opportunistic crook who preyed on unidentified people. He was a member of a well-organized network that coordinated thefts across several states and tracked important cargoes. The documents revealed that Rex received information about high V-value targets from partners in transport firms, truck stops, and even police enforcement. Before stealing the rigs and selling the cargo through a network of dishonest dealers, they would select drivers transporting pricey cargo and sabotage their trucks to cause breakdowns close to Rex's business. It was an intricate criminal organization that had been going unnoticed for many years. Even though I still didn't have a signal to send the photos, I took as many pictures of documents as I could with my phone. Then, in the hopes that someone would ultimately learn the truth even if I didn't live to report it myself, I placed evidence of Rex's misdeeds in locations where investigators would undoubtedly find it. I left the filing cabinet open with incriminating documents on display, strewn driver's licenses all around the basement, and placed some of the fake license plates in conspicuous places. I had done everything I could to reveal Rex's scheme by morning, but I still had to get out before he found out. Around 7 in the morning, Rex came to check on me, so I walked back to the customer lounge and acted like I was asleep. He offered to bring me breakfast from town and inquired about my sleep, seeming normal and polite. I gladly agreed, figuring I'd have time to get out while he was out of town. I had underestimated Rex's suspicions, though. When he went down to check his basement workshop instead of leaving right away, he found the sabotage within minutes. My time was up when I heard him yelling at his colleagues. In an attempt to surprise Rex when he approached me, I snatched up the bulky torch and took up position behind the customer lounge door. Unaware that I was waiting for him, Rex raced through the door with a revolver. He instantly went down as I struck him in the head as hard as I could with the torch. After snatching his keys and revolver, I hurried to the shop to see if any of the trucks were operational. Although I had not yet disabled my own rig, there was Rex had been driving an earlier Peterbilt as his own car. I drove out of there as quickly as the ancient truck would carry me after the keys fit and the engine started. I reported everything I saw when I drove directly to the Kansas State Police headquarters in Dodge City. The officers who took my statement were first dubious, but after seeing the pictures I had taken and the tangible proof I had provided, they decided to look into it right away. That afternoon, a SWAT team raided Rex's shop and discovered precisely what I had promised. Following their arrest, Rex Morrison and his two co-workers were accused of numerous murders, truck thefts, and organized crime offenses. According to the investigation, they had stolen more than $12 million worth of cargo and killed 23 truck drivers over a 15-year period. In addition to having ties to organized crime groups that utilize stolen trucks to transport illegal weapons and drugs, Rex's network included dishonest authorities in 6 states. Through their personal belongings, the 23 victims were ultimately identified. Discovered in Rex's basement, and their relatives were at last given information about loved ones who had just disappeared while performing their regular duties. Although The majority of the goods had already been sold through Rex's criminal network. A number of the stolen trucks were found and given back to their rightful owners. Rex Morrison received a life sentence without the chance of release. His colleagues were sentenced to 25 to 40 years in prison. The dishonest authorities who had supplied the entire criminal operation was dissolved, and those who provided information to the network were also prosecuted. However, the inquiry found that similar organizations, which preyed on lone truck drivers on remote roads, were most likely operating in other regions of the nation. I gave a detailed account of Rex's tactics and the extent of his illegal operations during my testimony at his trial. According to the prosecutor, my testimony was essential to getting all of the criminals convicted and to uncovering the larger network of truck theft operations. However, the fact that I had contributed to Rex's prosecution did not make the recollection of discovery that I had trusted a man who had been killing my fellow drivers for more than 10 years, or those 23 sets of personal belongings in his basement. No matter how bad my circumstances get, I never stop at little, remote repair shops anymore, even though I still travel the same routes across Kansas. I've discovered that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that appear to be the most trustworthy, love you like family, and go above and above to assist you. For 15 years, Rex Morrison established himself as Kansas' most trustworthy and honest mechanic. And he lured dozens of drivers to their deaths by using that reputation. Trust between drivers and those who maintain our equipment is the foundation of the trucking industry. However, crooks who know how vulnerable we are when our trucks break down in remote areas can take advantage of that confidence. Rex showed me that being skeptical even when people are acting normally isn't necessarily a bad thing, and that sometimes it's safer to stay cautious. Are making a special effort to assist you. Carl Madison and the 22 other drivers who trusted the wrong person and paid the price with their lives are always on my mind when I pass the site of Rex's shop. The building has been destroyed, leaving only an empty lot in front of a historical monument, cautioning visitors against putting their trust in strangers in remote areas. However, I recall what lay beneath that seemingly innocent-looking truck repair shop, and I keep in mind that evil can appear as generosity and goodwill. There are many people on the road who wish to assist truck drivers. However, not all of them are well-meaning. Some of them are predators who prey on our vulnerability and loneliness, taking advantage of our need for help to entice us into precarious circumstances. One of the most successful serial murders of truck drivers was Rex Morrison. In the history of America. And since he realized that, he was successful for 15 years. The biggest strength and weakness of a trucker is trust. At weight stations, every truck driver is familiar with the procedure. Be courteous, prepare your documentation, and leave quickly. The regulations at the weight station outside of Bakersfield were different. I almost lost everything because of rules. Steve Martinez is my name, and I have 19 years of professional driving experience. I have conducted inspections and passed through hundreds of weight stations throughout the period without experiencing any major incidents. I maintain my equipment, my cargo securely fastened, and my logs up to date. I abide by the rules because I am aware that a single serious infraction put a truck driver's career on hold. I'm still troubled by what happened at the Bakersfield weight station 8 months later. Because of this, neither an overzealous officer seeking to issue fines nor a normal inspection were involved. It was something far more serious. I learnt from this that corruption can occur anywhere, even in locations where law and order is expected. Legitimate law enforcement officials did not run the weight station that almost took my life. It was operated by crooks who preyed on truck drivers who were forced to comply with their demands by using the authority of their badges. I was transporting gadgets from Los Angeles to Phoenix on a Tuesday morning in March when the event started. It was just another run. I'd carried computer parts on numerous occasions for a technology company with contracts across the Southwest. The load was accurately recorded, I had plenty of time to deliver, and the weight was within the allowed range. I was enjoying the vacation and eager to return to Tucson to be with my family. I arrived at the Bakersfield Weight Station on Interstate 5 at around 10:30 a.m., approximately 60 miles north of Los Angeles. All commercial trucks had to halt for inspection, according to the electronic signs, which was standard procedure during rush hour, expecting a standard weigh-in that would take no more than 10 minutes. I pulled into the designated lane and followed the traffic flow towards the scales. However, I became aware that this weight station was unique as I got closer to the scale platform, the officers with patches and markings that were a little different from what I was used to seeing at official DOT facilities. The outfits of the traffic controllers did not appear to be completely correct, with faded paints and equipment that seemed antiquated. The building itself appeared older and more dilapidated than most weight stations. I waited for the weight readout after pulling on the scales. However, rather than the customary swift procedure, an officer came up to my window and requested that I turn off my engine, wearing a uniform that said Department of Transportation, but with small variances that made me uneasy. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with sunglasses and a mustache. Although his badge appeared genuine, he exuded an angry, rather than professional, manner. Without saying hello or providing an explanation, he demanded the license, registration and logbook. I turned in my paperwork, which was up to date and well maintained. Flipping through documents and taking notes on a clipboard, the officer looked at them for far longer than was required. 5 minutes or so later, he instructed me to pull forward to the inspection bay after returning the documents. "What is the problem, officer?" I asked nicely. "Is there something wrong with my weight or documentation?" "Routine inspection," was his gruff response. "Drive ahead and turn off your engine. Wait for instructions before getting out of your car." I parked in the inspection area, which was a covered bay away from the main traffic flow, as he instructed. In what seemed to be a routine inspection, the officer circled my truck with a torch, checking the tires, lights and cargo securement, but this inspection took more than an hour, as opposed to the customary 15 minutes, during which the officer took pictures of my load and paid close attention to my cargo area. After a while, the police came back to my taxi and requested that I get out. He ushered me into the poorly lighted, seemingly understaffed weight station building. Only two further individuals were in view, both donning Thiebath wore dubious uniforms and prioritized paperwork over traffic flow monitoring. The entire establishment seemed strange, as if it were run by unlicensed police enforcement personnel. As we entered a small office, the officer declared, "During your inspection, we have discovered several violations, inconsistencies in your logbook, equipment infractions, and improper load securement. Your car may be taken out of service for certain infractions, which also carry hefty fines." I was surprised. After checking my load securement that morning, I was certain it complied with all federal regulations. Just 2 weeks prior, my equipment had passed a thorough inspection and was in good working order. I knew of no infractions, and my logbook was up to date and correct. The officer was evasive when I sought to see the particular offences. "The total fines total $8,000, he added. "You have the option to pay right then and leave, or we can seize your automobile and its contents while the legal system handles the infractions. It usually takes 60 to 90 days to complete that process." For ordinary offences, $8,000 was a huge sum, much more than I had ever heard of for the kinds of offences he was talking about. However, losing my truck and goods for 3 months would ruin my business and most likely result in the loss of my home. I was forced to choose between paying a hefty fine and being impounded, which would have destroyed my finances. I informed the officer that I did not have $8,000 on me. "Can I create a payment plan or arrange payment through my employer?" The officer's smile was not one of friendliness. "For prompt settlement, we only take cash payments. but we do have agreements with nearby companies that can give drivers in your area short-term loans, circumstance, of course, for a fair price. I became aware of what was going on at that point. This was not an authorized wait station. These thieves had devised a clever scheme to defraud truck drivers of their money by fabricating infractions and then providing costly loans to cover the penalties. They were intimidating drivers into paying for alleged infractions that most likely did not exist by exploiting the authority of police uniforms and official-looking facilities. The officer informed me that phone calls were not allowed during active inspections when I asked to use my cell phone to contact the safety department of my firm. When I requested to speak with a supervisor, I was informed that the senior cop wouldn't be available until the next day, since he was in court. I started to feel more and more trapped and powerless as every request I made for outside help or verification was turned down. The officer escorted me to a different area where loan documentation was ready for a woman dressed in civilian clothing. She clarified that she worked for a nearby financial services firm that focused on providing commercial drivers with emergency financing. The terms were ridiculous. She claimed that the only way I could avoid being impounded and get back on the road was to pay her $8,000 at 30% interest over the course of 30 days, using my vehicle and cargo as collateral. Just as I was ready to sign the loan paperwork, I saw something that prevented me from committing a grave error. I could see my vehicle in the inspection area via the window, and someone else without a uniform was looking at my goods. While I was preoccupied with the fictitious inspection procedure, he was obviously stealing some of my consignment by loading boxes from my caravan into a vehicle. I recognized the entire extent of the illegal operation at that point. The fictitious wait station did more than extort money with exploitative loans and exorbitant fees. Additionally, it served as a cover for cargo theft, enabling the thieves to take expensive goods while the drivers were confined inside handling fictitious documentation. They were committing several crimes at once by abusing the power of law enforcement. I got up and declared that I wanted to confirm the validity of the inspection by getting in touch with the actual California Highway Patrol. My suspicions were validated by the prompt response. The fictitious officer grew hostile and intimidating, claiming that it was a federal offense to obstruct an inspection. The loan document holding woman began gathering her papers and getting ready to go. Bureaucratic intimidation gave way to barely disguised panic. Throughout the building, I said that I was going to contact 911 on my cell phone as I made my way to the door. I resisted the phony officer's attempt to stop me by grabbing my arm and moving towards the exit. I saw something at that moment that chilled me to the bone. At least 6 further vehicles at various inspection stages were visible to me through a different window, but their drivers were nowhere to be seen. Weeds were growing around the tires of some of the trucks because they had been there for a long time. After sprinting to my truck, I locked the doors behind me and got into the cab. Despite the phony officer's cries for me to stop, I fired up my engine and headed for the exit. I learnt at that point that the wait station was made to resemble a trap. One of the crooks manned the control booth, and a gate that required electronic authorization to operate blocked the exit. I had to make a choice fast. I could try to find another route out of the complex, or I could try to smash through the fence and risk ruining my truck. I decided to force the gate open, deciding that any harm to my stuff was better than whatever these thugs had in store for me. As I sped towards the exit, I crashed through the thin barrier, triggering alarms and scattering the phony officers. I reported the entire thing to the California Highway Patrol and drove directly to the closest actual police station. The officers who took my statements were dubious at first, but after I showed them where the phony wait was, they changed their minds. Station. They discovered proof of an intricate criminal network that had been preying on truck drivers for several months. The crooks had been exploiting a closed wait station facility that the state had abandoned years prior. According to the inquiry, They had made the structure appear functioning by renovating it, installing fictitious equipment, and designing IDs and uniforms that looked authentic to the untrained eye. Financial fraud, extortion, cargo theft, and in certain situations, truck hijacking, when drivers refused to cooperate, were all part of the operation. The loan shark, the phony officers, and many individuals involved in cargo theft activities were among the 7 individuals arrested in relation to the fictitious wait station. Additionally, the investigation found that they had stolen cargo, valued at over $3 million over a 6-month period, victimizing at least 40 truck drivers, and extorting predatory loans and fictitious fines totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. The drivers of the 6 vehicles I had seen at the site had been slain when they attempted to thwart the extortion plan. After killing them, the crooks kept their trucks as trophies with the intention of selling them on the illicit market. I discovered that if I hadn't noticed the cargo theft happening and fled at the appropriate time, I would most likely turned into their 8th murder victim. The criminal organization's chief was found guilty on several charges of organized crime, murder, and racketeering, and was given a life sentence without the possibility of release. His colleagues were sentenced to 20 to 50 years in prison. The California Highway Patrol put new security measures in place and destroyed the phony wait station to stop truck drivers from being the target of similar schemes in the future. However, I learnt a valuable lesson from the event regarding the daily vulnerabilities faced by truck drivers. We are obvious targets for crooks who might pose as law enforcement because we are legally compelled to stop at wait stations and submit to inspections. The majority of drivers would never doubt the legitimacy of someone operating out of a facility with an official appearance and wearing a uniform, especially if they are threatening to fine you or have you impounded. I now have a list of the addresses and phone numbers of reputable wait stations with me. Additionally, I confirm the legitimacy of any inspection that appears out of the ordinary or overly thorough. When something doesn't feel right, I've learnt to follow my gut, even when dealing with what seem to be law enforcement personnel. Above all, if I suspect that I am interacting with criminals instead of law enforcement, I never hesitate to call actual police. I learnt from the wait station nightmare that illegal activity and corruption may occur anywhere, even in areas where law and order is supposed to be present. Not all uniforms match a legitimate authority, is not always represented by the officer, and the badge, those who seem to be defending us, can sometimes be predators who take advantage of our admiration for law or enforcement to harm us. These days, whenever I go near a wait station, I think of the phony police officers in Bakersfield who almost killed me. I recall the 6 killed drivers whose vehicles were displayed in the prison-like awards, and I recall that being watchful and skeptical are not indications of disdain for law enforcement, but rather essential survival skills in a field where criminals frequently pose as the same individuals who are meant to keep us safe. Although there are many persons with badges and uniforms on the road, not all of them have merited the position of power they purport to hold. I learnt from the wait station outside of Bakersfield that those who appear most authentic are frequently the most dangerous offenders, and that occasionally the only way to survive means to challenge authority when your gut tells you something is off.